Great, so welcome back everyone, and it's now time for our session on interdisciplinary supervision, which has been a hot topic within our membership in general, but has also come up already today in our session on methodologies. And I think it's quite a cross-cutting topic because your supervisors are, well, hopefully part of a lot of what you do with your research, and therefore they can the relationship with your supervisor and how you work out different issues with your research design can be quite involving, especially with an interdisciplinary project where you might have supervisors that come from different disciplines. Maybe your supervisors haven't done much interdisciplinary work themselves, but you've brought them together in that way, or you're bringing interdisciplinary ideas to your PhD because you're the driver of your own PhD and you're trying to convince them of this. This presentation was made based off of a few things, but one was an informal conversation that our member Dean Smith, who will be joining us tomorrow but couldn't make it today, he put together a lot of these slides, and also based on an informal discussion he hosted for the network a couple of months ago. So there's a few ideas that came up from the network around not just moaning about challenges we might have with managing our supervisors, but actually strategies and trying to deal with that and move past some of the issues that come up. So Dean put together a lot of this, as well as Nawal, who's with us today. She did a lot of work in looking up some reference material for you guys, and also just trying to put in some more of her experiences as well. So I'm going to be giving the presentation, but this is based off of work that was done by, a lot of it was done by Dean and Nawal and myself, and other contributions from members in the network over the last few years. So without further ado, what we will be speaking about is first, as I said, around these common challenges and strategies for overcoming them. And then we're going to have a session called support circles, which is something that I've come across lots more in working in organizations that use them for dealing with interpersonal challenges that might have come up between staff members, or just in general challenges that people are going with on a personal or professional level, and having supports from your peers in a structured way to work through them. So I'll explain more about that in a bit, and then we'll just have a brief closing for the day before you can go off for your lunch break. So yeah, as I mentioned, this is a hot topic in our network. So some of the things that have come up in past conversations from our members' experiences about supervision are people saying, I feel like an oddball, it's easy to fall through the cracks. Each of my supervisors fundamentally contradicts the other. I don't know how to resolve the issue. My supervisors reject my ideas, but I don't think they understand them. So there's not this trust that the rejection has come from a place of understanding. Rather, its rejection has come from just maybe either a misinterpretation of what you're saying as the PhD student, or just through pure stubbornness or whatever it might be. And another common sentiment is I don't get any critical feedback on my ideas. That could also be because if you're bringing in ideas that your supervisors haven't dealt with before, maybe they don't have critical feedback for you because they don't feel prepared to give you that feedback. And similarly, like, my perspectives are interpreted as challenges and not accepted, meaning that maybe the idea isn't taken as an idea, but as a challenge to your supervisor's idea. So these are a few of the things we've heard and members have contributed as issues they've had with their supervisors, and are quite specific, not quite specific, but can be more common in an interdisciplinary PhD. So all of that taken into consideration, we've kind of distilled this down into 3 common themes. So the first being contrasting perspectives from different supervisors, and that being magnified when they come from different disciplines. And the second one being resistance from your supervisors to bringing in other disciplines or novel approaches that stray from the traditional or stray from the norms of that discipline that they come from. And the third one being accessing support for theories, approaches, or methods that are beyond the expertise of your supervisors. So how do you get that support if your supervisors don't have that background to share with you, or that advice to share with you? Yes, so it's very easy to get stuck in kind of complaining and moaning about issues you might have with your supervisors. And though I think it's totally healthy to rant and amongst your peers about these things, it can be quite cathartic to say, oh, I'm having that problem too. And we might even get to a bit of that during this discussion. I think it's also important to speak about strategies for dealing with those challenges, and that's one way that we can also share as peers, as fellow students, to say, oh, I've been through that, and these are some of the ways that I've tried to deal with it. It might work for you as well. And so these are things that we've spoken about within our network, and hopefully you'll be able to contribute some new ideas as well. And we'll keep growing this body of strategies and tips and tricks for the next time we do a session like this. We'll have your ideas as part of it too. So one strategy for dealing with contrasting perspectives between your supervisors is to actually determine whether the disagreement is arising from a misinterpretation of the information you've brought to them. So they're not fully understanding what it is you're saying because maybe you're using words that are unfamiliar to them, or whatever the case may be. But the disagreement isn't an actual disagreement with the idea, but with the misinterpretation of your idea. So whether it's that, or whether it's a fundamental disagreement, meaning that they've understood what you've said, but they fundamentally disagree. Or is it based on something like academic orthodoxy, or Joanna was mentioning in the last session something around being dogmatic about an approach, and that's where the disagreement is coming from. So it may not even be a fundamental disagreement, but just one that's more of a stubborn nature, potentially. And knowing which one of these kind of broad root causes for the disagreement is really important for trying to move past it, because they'll each have their different ways of doing that. And I think it's important to start with ruling out misinterpretation as the source of the disagreement, because that's the easiest thing to get past, right? And it also helps you communicate your research better. And so ruling out misinterpretation requires us to communicate ideas in a way that people from any discipline could understand and engage with. And it can also help to ask the supervisors, your supervisor or supervisors, to reflect and articulate the root cause of their disagreement to you. So not just trying to, figure this out on your own, but also having them tell you and reflect on their own, on their own, to say what is really making me disagree with this idea or concept or whatever it is you've brought forward to them. So 2 tools or tips that we've talked about in the past about maybe communicating ideas to supervisors in a way that will clarify to them what you're trying to get across. One really interesting one that I think Dean actually brought up was using something called process maps. And Nawal pointed out to me earlier that the figure for process maps, if you look at it closely, is in Spanish, but that was actually on purpose, because the point is the visual and not necessarily what was written in there. But anyway, a process map, it kind of shows what process you took to get to the conclusion that you came to. So it can be really useful to show why you're using certain theories or why you're using certain methods and what kind of thinking led into the next decision. It's kind of a record of the decisions that you've made, and the different, you can also include things like the different bodies of literature you've looked into, or the kind of debates that are within those that led to making a decision, or even something from the for example, the tables we were looking at in the last session around alignment, you could make a decision based on the fact that something isn't well aligned with what you're trying to say, or is missing something you would like to say and isn't clearly captured by using a particular method. And that's why you've chosen to bring in this other discipline, or an idea or an approach from another discipline. So yeah, this can also help yourself, but it can also be helpful for your supervisors to see all the work and the background thinking that's gone into arriving at the point that you've arrived at when you're speaking with them about this. Hopefully you would have spoken with them along the way as well, and they won't be totally blank about this, but putting it in one place can be useful for them. It can also be useful later on for you as a reference. We spoke about this in our last session a few months ago about using process maps in your thesis. You can reference them, you can put them in an appendix that has way more detail than what you'll be able to actually have the word count space for in your thesis, because diagrams offer a lot of information without using too many words. You might not want to include them right in the thesis, but you can use them even as like what Zoe was saying in the last session around, if you're asked this in the Viva, this will be much clearer to you about why you made decisions, and you can use that in order to more clearly articulate your justification, not just to your supervisors, but in your Viva and even to yourself. And then the second thing we've talked a lot about in the past is this idea of translating. So putting things in words and in a way that even a non-expert audience or non-academic audience would be able to understand, because that's kind of the nature of interdisciplinary communication. And this is something I think Zoe will get into in the writing session tomorrow, is how you say something will determine whether people can also agree with it, because if they don't understand it, they're not maybe going to be able to disagree or agree or get something from it. So doing a 3-minute pitch, trying to be as concise as possible, trying to use language that anyone would understand, that transcends disciplines, will be helpful even for communicating with your supervisors, and not just as something to be used to communicate to the public or back to your participants or whatever the case may be. It's a tough task to filter out all that background info and still say something that is clearly justifying why you've brought together concepts from different disciplines. So practicing that and trying to make a pitch and being intentional about that can be one tool. So if you've gone through all that and you've established that your supervisors really do fundamentally disagree with you, it's kind of, there's that might be telling you something. So if it's clear that everyone understands what you're saying, but they fundamentally disagree, or one person fundamentally disagrees, maybe due to a theoretical standpoint they have, maybe like, for example, from our last session, maybe they feel that the epistemology or it doesn't match your methods that you've chosen. It may be worth investigating why they have brought this to your attention. It could indicate that you've tried to bring together two ideas or multiple ideas that are somehow internally incompatible, and you actually need to rework or compromise, tweak it a little bit so that it is compatible, lean on another, or lean on one of the disciplines maybe a bit more heavily than another in that instance. Whatever the case may be, it might not just be that they're being stubborn, they might have a point. And so, yeah, it might be worth revisiting that. And the second point is, it's okay to disagree sometimes. This came up in our last session as well. Sometimes it will become clear that one person on your supervisory team has a really strong opinion, but it doesn't actually indicate that something in your design is incompatible or incommensurate, and that this person just has a really strong opinion, and that's not the way they would do it, but it doesn't mean that you can't do it that way. So you may decide not to actually incorporate their views in that case, and either go with the majority of your supervisors or your preference for one justifiable choice over another. And this point is related to the next challenge we're going to talk about around ownership of your own PhD. So something that came up already today, dealing with resistance from your supervisors. to something you've brought to them either from another discipline or a novel idea is the first thing is have confidence in your own work. You have likely already spent more time thinking about your specific study design than your supervisors have. You do have knowledge, even at early stages, though it may be difficult to feel that way at the time. And we've already heard a couple of people speak today around the fact that they wish they had gone with their own ideas and not been so influenced at the beginning, because they didn't have the confidence then to think about it in that way. I've had that experience in my own PhD as well. There was a few things that early on I was pretty sure I wanted to do and ended up dropping them because of resistance, and kind of regret that now, because once you get further along the line, it's kind of hard to go back. So do have confidence in your own work, but at the same time, and the second point is try to discern when to listen and when to push back. You know, having confidence is important, but you also have supervisors, as I said, for a reason. It may not always feel that way, but they might be giving you sensible advice. And I think a lot of times one way to discern whether to consider their resistance as useful feedback or not is to see, or to ask whether, or ask yourself and reflect on whether or not it's a process piece of feedback they're giving to you, or if it's something that they just are not familiar with and therefore pushing back on. Maybe it's something that's coming from another discipline and they don't know enough to really accept it. And then it goes back to this interpretation and communication of your idea rather than something that's you need to consider. So for example, an example of something that's more process related or something that's more related to your PhD, doing your PhD is, you know, in hindsight, this has happened to me and others as well. Advice leaning towards scaling down, for example, feels really bad at the time, but it's usually quite good advice. I hate being told that I can't look at something or I can't look into something, or I can't, you know, it's something, if I'm interested in it, I would rather be looking at it. And I think that's okay at the beginning, very early stages of your PhD, to be quite broad. And everyone says this, and I agree, like, you know, explore all the things. But when your supervisors start giving you quite good advice about how to scale that down and how to hone that in, I feel like many of us maybe were quite ambitious about how much you could fit into one PhD. And I think some have managed to do that. Like I've heard recently Zoe presented on her research, and I couldn't believe how many data chapters she has. Like, people do it, Zoe's doing it, but like I think sometimes we don't realize how much work we are pitching as part of our study design, and that often the feedback from your supervisors can be quite useful in trying to hone that in. So don't automatically assume that they don't that they're just disagreeing with you because they want to have control. Sometimes it is for a reason. So there's that. But if you're going the confident route, and you want to really convince your supervisors of something that you are very convinced about yourself, it's good to try to assemble some evidence for them, both for and against what you're saying. So and what I mean by that is you want to find, as I said earlier, evidence out there of someone having done this before or using a similar logic. And the part about against is if you found critiques of your what you're planning to do or would like to do, actually analyzing those critiques and trying to understand, you know, if their critique actually applies in your case or not. You can dispute their positions, that kind of thing. I think Dean himself has some experience doing this. So if you are thinking about providing analysis of critics, I think he'd be a good person to connect with, because he's done this for his supervisors, and this comes from something he's done. So I haven't done this personally, but I feel like it feels like a good idea, and Dean's done it. Oh, so yeah. The second piece of advice is visualize it. build out a theoretical framework that brings all the pieces together and shows how you plan to actually carry out your research. That can be more convincing than just saying it, having a plan in place that then the conversation can become about how you do it rather than whether you should do it at all. And that is something I have found useful. And not only is it useful for your supervisors, but sometimes it's useful for yourself to then realize where their feedback might have merit, and it makes their feedback more specific to what you want to get from them. Because instead of arguing about whether an idea is worth pursuing or not, you're arguing, or not arguing, but discussing how you'll do it. And then, you know, there, in some cases, it might be worth re-examining the relationship you have with your supervisors, and bring this to their attention if you're able to. And if you don't feel comfortable, then, you know, there are others at the university, whether in your department or whatever, that can act as a mediator if it's really getting to be quite bad in terms of being rejected, all your ideas being rejected all the time, or something of that nature, is also not a positive working environment for you. And you need to be able to stand up for yourself, or be able to get someone to help you do that. And this is something that Dean spent a lot of time talking about a couple months ago, is that he found this really interesting article in the conversation, which I've linked to on this slide, and it kind of outlines 10 different types of supervision relationships. And what I've just described is kind of an example of the first one, where the clone of your supervisor, where if your supervisor is just basically saying, you need to do things the way that I would do them, then they're taking away ownership from you. They can have great input, and that's fine, but you aren't your supervisor's clone, and you shouldn't be expected to be. So that's one example. There's many other examples here, and I won't go over them in detail now because they're not necessarily specific to doing an interdisciplinary PhD. They're, I think, something that all doctoral students face at some point, or would characterize their relationship with their supervisor as one of these types. But trying as much to shift that role of your supervisor from that hierarchical kind of top-down role to more of a fellow researcher or fellow traveler on this journey through the process of making of doing your thesis is really important. So I'll leave you with a link, and you can go and explore what these other types of relationships with your supervisors might be, and you'll probably connect or link your own experiences to one of or two of them more than others. Hopefully not. Some of them are really quite unfortunate, the creepy collar and some other unfortunate ones. So I really hope no one here has had to deal with that kind of relationship, but yeah, look on your own time with that. The third one, the third theme around accessing support for theories, approaches, and methods that go beyond your supervisor's expertise. So, I mean, one obvious way is if your supervisors don't know it, maybe they know somebody who does. So if they can't help you, they should be able to, and they do have the role. They should be trying to connect you to someone who does. But that doesn't always work out really well. I know my supervisors have tried to connect me to people in their networks that know what I'm trying to do. For example, I really wanted to use social network analysis, but none of my supervisors have ever done that. So they know vaguely what it is, but wouldn't be able to advise me on the method. So one of my supervisors connected me to someone who they thought had done it before. It turned out to be kind of a goose chase because they connected me to somebody who hadn't really done what I wanted to do. We ended up talking and it was interesting, but it didn't really help me with that. And so it was maybe not as useful as my supervisor would have liked it to have been. And that's not their fault, but it just didn't help me, right? So I think for me, resolving that knowledge gap on how to do social network analysis, I actually went down and I asked if the Interdisciplinary Research Network could host a session on that, which they did. And it's been really useful. So that's one where your peers can come in. You know, this knowledge exchange and access through other students' training and other students' connections has been really useful for me personally in my PhD. And I also, related to the last point, I took a training specifically on that. And as I note there, unfortunately, that often requires quite a hefty budget, but not always. And you can target, if you have a small research budget, really targeting the most relevant or most in-depth training that you need to get those skills in a particular method or discipline, subject specific knowledge, then you can do that. I often talk about a conference sandwich strategy for a PhD, which is basically the idea of going to lots of conferences early on in the PhD to get an idea of what's out there and who's out there, and build a network of people who know what you want to know. And then maybe not doing a lot of conferencing in the middle of the PhD when you don't have anything to present and you've already kind of done a lot of networking. Not saying turn it off completely, and then turning it up at the end again when you have something to present. You can go and present at conferences. So that's one way of looking at that networking strategy. So just these three in the middle. There's you can also reach out to other people in your department. Don't be afraid to do that. Even if, some people get a little bit nervous about reaching out to others in the department if they haven't told their supervisors. I think you can just tell your supervisors that you're going to meet somebody about whatever you want to get guidance on. Often people are quite open to that. And then industry professionals, going beyond academia for support has been really useful in my PhD, for example. Talking with people from the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency and things like that. And then we've had an example actually, again from Zoe, was speaking about actually getting subject-specific knowledge from her participants. And that kind of subject-specific knowledge often can be more real-world evidence for a discourse from a field. But then the work is then going back to the academic literature and trying to rectify that or link them somehow. So I think the last resort is changing or bringing in additional supervisors. And, I think there's an ongoing question about when to do that and when not to do that. Generally speaking, if you know already early on that you need a different supervisor or would like to change one, I think it's best to do that earlier on. If you wait too long, it becomes a bit of a faff to do that and maybe not worth it. And then you do end up in my situation where you might get a very large supervisory team. And I think I have 6 supervisors now, and they all play a role in my PhD, and I appreciate the contribution of each of them, but probably could have been streamlined a little bit more from the beginning, if I'm being completely honest. So yeah, I think that's also another thing that happens with interdisciplinary PhDs. A lot of the time you end up with a lot of people involved, and that's just the nature of the beast. So it's also not a problem necessarily. It just gives you more work to do in managing your supervisors. So that is some of what we've discussed as a network in the past. And I am going to shortly stop the recording and move over to our Mentimeter again to ask you what challenges you faced within your supervisors in your interdisciplinary PhD. So I will stop the recording now and stop the recording.